I'm Frato Rucci, and it's a great pleasure to host the first panel of the webinar series of the Indian Ocean Working Group at Georgetown, Qatar. Since its inception in 2014, the working group has convened researchers from across the world to build collaborative expertise to remap the Indian Ocean world through historical circularities of people, culture, knowledge, ideas, commodities, technology, architecture, labor, and capital. And as the current situation has pushed everyone to make more creative use of the affordances of digital technologies in pursuing research, we decided to launch a webinar series on a range of topics related to Indian Ocean studies with distinguished scholars in the field. In our first panel for today, we thought it would be apt to start with the current and future directions of Indian Ocean humanities. Our distinguished panelists will share their reflections on the current methodological, disciplinary, and theoretical issues of Indian Ocean humanities, what has been done so far, including any initiatives, programs, seminars that they led or participated in, and how the global future of Indian humanities looks like from their window. To introduce our panelists, Ananya Jahanara Kabir is Professor of English Literature at King's College London. For her innovative work in the humanities, she received the Infosys Humanities Prize 2018 and the Humboldt Research Prize awarded by the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, Germany. She is the author of Territory of Desire, representing the Valley of Kashmir, 2009, Partitions Post-Amnesia, 1947-1971, and Modern South Asia. And she's currently writing Allegro Politics, Connecting on the Afro-Modern Dance Floor. And she also has a new research project titled Creole Indias, which develops the concept of transoceanic creolization through memory work across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Next, we have Ari Gautier, our one and only creative talent as a novelist of the Indian Ocean. Currently based in London, Ari spent his childhood in former French colony Pondicherry, India. He is the author of Carnet Secret de Lakshmi and Le Thinai, two novels which creatively interperse Tamil, Hindi, Creole, and English with French, reflecting the multilingual identities of those living in Pondicherry. Ari and Ananya are also co-founders of the cultural platform Le Thinai Creole. And we have two panelists from the UC system. Jeremy Presholdt is Professor of History at the University of California, San Diego, where he specializes in African, Indian Ocean, and global history with emphasis on consumer culture and politics. Jeremy is the author of Domesticating the World, African Consumerism and the Genealogies of Globalization, 2008, which addressed East African demands for imported goods and how this shaped global exchanges in the 19th century. And Icons of Dissent, the global resonance of Che, Marley, Tupac, and Bin Laden, 2019, which sheds new light on the transnational and temporal factors that define icons. He is currently at work on a book project titled Sea, Soil, and the State, The Politics of Belonging on the Kenyan Coast. And our fourth panelist, Vilashini Cooppan, is Professor of Literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her book, Worlds Within: National Narratives and Global Connections in Post-Colonial Writing, appeared from Stanford University Press in the series Cultural Memory in the Present. Her essays on postcolonial and world literatures, globalization theory, literatures of slavery and diaspora, and cultural theory of race and ethnicity, psychoanalysis and nationalism, have appeared in major journals and several edited volumes. She is completing a book titled The World at Large: Memoryscapes in World Literature. On behalf of the Indian Ocean Working Group at Georgetown, Qatar, thank you once again for agreeing to join our webinar from 4 different time zones. Without further ado, I'd like to leave the floor to Vilashini.
Thank you, Firat, for organizing this wonderful panel. I hope it's the first of many conversations, and thanks to all of the panelists. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you today. I want to suggest, by way of opening our conversation, that we can think Indian Ocean studies through 3 gestures: looking out, looking back, and looking in. And I want to talk about these 3 as a way of sketching a kind of disciplinary methodological history, and also, as Firat has asked us to do, to give a sense of future directions that I myself and my colleagues are working on, and hopefully that will spark some conversation among our panelists and our listeners. Looking out, the first of my 3 categories, entails connection. It's the thick mapping of circulations and migrations of people, commodities, cultural practices, ideas, and more. Looking out envisions networks of routes and trades, the crisscrossing of a region, but by what is often taken to be nascent cosmopolitanism, dating well before the modern era, a nascent cosmopolitanism that has been eroded by subsequent imperial, national, and even regional vectors of power. When we think about looking out, we are necessarily looking back and looking out, and I'll get to that in a minute. I think we are also necessarily working with the tensions between the global and the local and seeing their necessary interpenetration. Turns out that looking out is also a species in our field of looking doubly. That means seeing the pull of connection and the push of differentiation, seeing both cosmopolitanism and particularism, seeing both singularity and relationality. And in this, I think the contemporary studies of the Indian Ocean have been deeply shaped by the globalization theory that emerged in the 1990s and continued on at a fever pitch through the early 2000s. And I think that's one mark on the field. There are, of course, older and deeper ones having to do with the historiography of the Indian Ocean. And there are others that have to do with the pushes towards world history and world literature. And I want to think about how all of these are working together in our field formations. So moving from looking back to looking out to looking back, I now want to think about the historiographic and methodological work of reconstructing the story of these deep, connective relational histories. Looking back has produced field-shaping reconsiderations of historical time. We could think about the longue durée of Brodelian, Mediterranean-focused world history. We could think about the cyclical, concentric displacement of Wallersteinian analysis of the capitalist world system with its changing centers. We could think about the non-capitalist and pre-modern formations and durations of religious, ethnic, and linguistic communities that many people want to use to produce a less capital-centered narrative than that of world systems theory. Moving on, looking back, I think also entails not only thinking about historical time shape, but about the practice and work of comparison. This could be comparative history, it could be comparative literature. Both of these terms have been sharply reoriented in dialogue with world history, world literature, even the notion of what is often called the Indian Ocean world. Are all sites for an ongoing dialogue methodologically and in terms of the very object itself. Many people are asking, is there such a thing as an Indian Ocean world? Is it a kind of figment produced by the cottage industry of world literature and world history? What do we gain from a world perspective? And that's something I have been particularly interested in as a world literature scholar, among other things. I would say that the notion of world and worlding are woven with the practice of looking back and looking out. I would say that looking back and looking out, or the looking back is the warp, looking in is the weft, and the whole weave is the world, in the worlding of the Indian Ocean or another region. My image here has conjured textiles, warp and weft. And I do that because I want to point to the world of goods, commodities, and things, the rich materiality of the Indian Ocean world, a materiality that drives a method. That method looks, gathers, situates. For example, it places the cloth of sails, of saris, the white ihram clothing of the Hajj, in motion across a field that then reveals a deep connected history. The history of Dao cultures, the sails, of Indian indenture, the saris, of the Muslim pilgrimage routes, the ihram clothing. This material method, in looking back and looking out, works not just for textiles in the larger world of commodities, and not just for cultural practices and ideas, but for texts. And so I want to talk a little bit about the particularities of literary history in Indian Ocean studies, not with any detail, just with a few big picture ideas. For literary studies, in the Indian Ocean brings to the fore some issues that world literature is putting on the table about how to map Indian Ocean, how to map literary categories. Is Indian Ocean literature scalable and readable, for example, in the forms of the trees versus waves that Franco Moretti has proposed? There are certainly philological trees and genealogical trees in Indian Ocean literature, given its preoccupation with the family history saga, with cultural and linguistic graftings, the rich vernacularized traditions of these texts. And I think that term, it's Niall Green's term, vernacularization, is really helpful in thinking about Indian Ocean literary studies, which have been too focused on the compass of the Anglophone post-colonial novel. So there's a call now, we could call it to de-Gauchify Indian Ocean literature. And I think vernacularization and the philological trees and genealogical trees of this literature are helpful. At the same time, though, I want us to also think about how waves might be applicable to Indian Ocean literature. As we start to think about the whirlpools of literary circulation, trees seem a little too stable, and a little too descent-based, and a little too tied into the conceptual architecture of nationalist genealogies. So waves may have a better purchase in our modeling of literary genre and patterns of literary history. For Moretti, when he talks about waves, he's thinking about the sweeping spread of something, a genre, a mode, a set of devices. But I think in Indian Ocean studies, we are putting the water back into the wave and thinking about it less metaphorically and more materially, thinking about the possibility of a liquid literature animated by what Weichi Dimak has wonderfully called the wateriness of genre. Its recirculatory categories of use and reuse. I have thought, looking back as a literary scholar, and now I want to briefly shift and think about how looking back works with other disciplinary orientations and methods. And I really like, Jeremy, your statement. I'm going to quote you if I may. Remembering histories of a relentlessly interdependent world can challenge contemporary fantasies of past isolation and our obsession with independent, local, or regional historical trajectories, unquote. So this idea that remembering histories can challenge our sort of particularist idols and sort of imaginaries of the present. I really like this work, and it resonates with my own work as a literary scholar because I'm interested in the afterlives of a particular imaginative fiction, which is, I think, what Jeremy is getting at. And I think, similarly, I'm interested in opening up the present so that we can think about a present in which particular identities are resurgent, imperial legacies, ethno-nationalist compacts, and we can look back and out from it to deeper histories of interconnectivity, reciprocal being, cooperation. There's a danger in this work, which I think you and I, everyone in this conversation probably shares, which is we don't want to create nostalgic idols of a cosmopolitanism that was, against which we measure the failures of the present that is. So I think there's a kind of rigorous need to historicize our categories, be it cosmopolitanism, connectivity, reciprocity, exchange, even the kind of materiality and object-heavy notion, the thing theory quality of the Indian object world. These things all have to be thought in their time, and also comparatively as kind of portals to connect times and spaces. So this is why, as a comparatist, trained in comparative literature, Indian Ocean Studies have seemed to me to be one of the most capacious and sort of moving targets of a field to work in. Things are simply not as calcified. This too is part of the wet, watery, liquid nature of this field formation. When we think about the future of the studies, of Indian Ocean Studies, there are a number of different directions. I want to mention a couple projects, the first of which is one we did at UCSC, at UC Santa Cruz, called Feminist Futures in the Indian Ocean World. I worked on it with my colleague Nidhi Mahajan in anthropology and three wonderful graduate students, Kelsey McFall in literature, Axel Boyer in history of art and visual culture, and Hafsa Sise in history of consciousness. We were interested in the unspoken quality of feminist scholarship and feminist methodology in Indian Ocean scholarship. We were extremely eager to bring back the weight of the body in a field often defined and synonymous with the materiality of goods, and to think about what the body, the zone of affect, of memory, of sensation, historicized frameworks around bodies could offer to the field. Another thing we did in this workshop was to train ourselves in digital mapping techniques. So I think the visuality that we wanted to bring to our explorations of feminist futures, and we're fortunate to have a number of people interested in visual arts, really allowed us to do the necessarily interdisciplinary work of Indian Ocean Studies in a very rich way. The last thing I want to talk about goes back to my third gesture. I had looking out, connecting, looking back, historiographical concerns, and my third one is looking in. Looking in is a way I use to describe the access of memory in Indian Ocean Studies. And I want to sort of situate that alongside the access of history, but also argue for it as a separate methodological approach, asking different questions, taking up different categories. Memory is of course, a necessary supplement to history, given that the history of the Indian Ocean is also a history of things not seen or held, not deeply material, things that were blown out on breezes, submerged beneath surfaces, need to be raised like treasure, the bones and pearls of the field formation. And I'm thinking when I say this of Edward Glissant's call to tell history from the bones of the Middle Passage in a series of books that are also deeply concerned with genres of literary representation and genres of historical time. That work of memory has been taken up along with Glissant by Gilroy, Saija Hartman, Dion Brand, so many people who've made memory central to the reckoning with slavery in the Atlantic world, and I think that's something that carries over to Indian Ocean memory-based studies. Memory is working both as critical concept often and an auto-theoretical voicing, a way of writing. One thinks of Hartman's work or Brand, or in the Indian Ocean context of Kalturabuli and Kulitude poetics, to say nothing of all of the rich experiments that Indian Ocean scholars are doing with memory-based voices, May Joseph Sea Log, various kinds of turns to the personal. I think that together these are experiments in what I'm interested in calling memory's pulse. These are the heartbeats of a sensory record of Indian Ocean lives, desires, identifications, longings, performances, doings. Sense memory, and May Joseph uses this term, requires going deep into cultures of migration and diaspora and exile. It requires taking up shards of exchange, this is her term, mnemonic traces, the spaces of the senses, so that we can produce, in her wonderful phrase after Michael Tausig, tactile knowing. And I'm interested in the shape of tactile knowing alongside the liquidity of Indian Ocean field formations. What does that look like? How can methodologies in a variety of disciplines achieve this sort of tactility? And how can it be more than what I earlier evoked with many depths to this history as the thick materiality of the history of things and goods in the Indian Ocean? So we're doing a project right now at UCSC. It's called Making Sense of Memory, and it's funded by our Humanities Research Institute and the UC-wide Humanities Research Institute. And we're interested in really getting into distinct scapes of memory. Some have to do with the Indian Ocean. Other people in this project work with South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa, South Africa. We're interested in how not only the history of empire and slavery, but also indenture, apartheid, genocide, Anthropocene planetary violence are all scales against which memory is surging up. We want to think how fleshly connectivities and thing-based connectivities, how ritual practices, how embodied experiences all produce memory, and how from that we can map the different fields, the area fields that we're working in, South Asia studies, Indian Ocean studies, African studies. One of the things I like about this contemporary project is that it actually takes the work of a number of us, it's the same group we worked on last year, and our work in Indian Ocean studies, and treats that not just as a conversation amongst ourselves, but as a starting point. Indian Ocean Studies in this project is a generative field for a number of questions, categories, analytics, models that we're then using in conversation with other field formations. And that to me is an important part of, I suppose we could call it a kind of deprovincializing of Indian Ocean Studies as well. So I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to being in conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vilashini, for this rich opening. Now, Jeremy will take the lead.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing this event and for offering us this space to reflect, and for accommodating us here on the other side of the world in California. And thanks, Vilashini, for your incredibly valuable points. This was a fantastic introduction. And I'd like to pick up on some of those points and also offer some kind of general thoughts about Indian Ocean studies, at least its recent past. But the first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge its incredible growth, particularly since the 1990s. It's really been phenomenal. And I think it should be said, since we're in a humanities forum, that humanities have really been at the forefront of this growth right through, especially in the last 25 years. So there's this really dynamic conversation that's happening around the Indian Ocean as a concept, as a methodology, as a field that Vilashini's comments were speaking to. And I think the multidisciplinarity of that conversation is, as we've seen, refining the theoretical insights of this field, even if the field is at times fractured. But I think it's, in a lot of ways, becoming less fractured, and that's worthy of some consideration as well. To me, what's particularly exciting are the transregional, multi-sided research endeavors that are incredibly sophisticated, more sophisticated than my own research, which sort of looks at the Indian Ocean from sort of one perspective. But looking at multiple forms of engagement and their reverberations, I think these kinds of projects are really redefining the field entirely. And actually, in a sense, making it more coherent. So I think this and other innovative research has illuminated the particular lines of connectivity, and so has written Indian Ocean interfaces back into national and continental histories. That's one of my interests, sort of understanding how Indian Ocean interfaces are being interpreted in the context of the nation and in area studies. And I think that's true even for connections that have received less attention. It's true in East Africa, where I work. Scholars of South Africa, for instance, have more centrally placed the Indian Ocean back into South Africa's past and present through reflections on the meaning of Indian Ocean linkages. And on that note, colleagues in Japan, who I've been working with recently, are studying Japanese production of consumer goods, primarily textiles, for Indian Ocean markets, and in particular in the colonial era, in the interwar period and after the Second World War. And this research on Japanese linkages with Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Africa, as well as Southern Africa, is demonstrating the mutuality of those connections. And I think that one of the important things about that work is that it underscores the importance of the Indian Ocean to other world regions, something that I've tried to do in my own work in relation to the United States. I also think there are, in a general sense, there are some really positive signs of the growing profile of Indian Ocean studies within academia. We could look at the number of journals that have sort of emerged in the relatively recent past, but also the increasing openness of area studies journals to doing special issues on the Indian Ocean. This is one of the things that I've been involved in a couple of them recently, and I think this is a very positive turn as well. And on that note, the last thing I'd like to say is that multiple presses have offered, Indian Ocean series in the very recent past. Perhaps some of you know that Routledge just launched another Indian Ocean series, Indian Ocean Transasia, which had its first volume published just earlier this month. So I think these are really important openings, and in places like the US, where the Indian Ocean doesn't receive the same attention as other oceanic fields, and is sometimes ignored altogether, these and other openings like this, I think, well, I hope, can encourage a greater acknowledgement of the centrality of Indian Ocean societies to broader global currents, both in the past as well as in the present. Most importantly, I think the significant institutional engagement within the Indian Ocean region is redefining the field. And here, Georgetown, Qatar's leadership as an engine for this conversation, I think, is really critical, and it's very exciting. But of course, many other institutions, just in Indian Ocean Africa, for instance, come to mind: Center for Indian Studies in Africa at WITS, University of Mauritius, Zanzibar Indian Ocean Research Institute, OIOS at Réunion, University of Réunion. I mean, there's been this kind of institutional buy-in to Indian Ocean studies that I think is really critical to redefining the field. And of course, we've seen this outside the region as well. McGill's Indian Ocean World Center, Leiden Center for Indian Ocean Studies now, and multi-year projects that we've all been involved with, including here in UC Davis just completed a multi-year multidisciplinary initiative, reimagining Indian Ocean worlds. So again, this conversation is growing, and it's growing exponentially, I feel, especially in the last decade or so. And in my field, in history, which I should speak to maybe a little bit more specifically, we've seen a number of major groundbreaking monographs in recent years, which have articulated Indian Ocean studies with national histories, with area studies, and with various thematic fields. And I think these have drawn distinctions and parallels with other oceanic fields, but has also raised some additional questions of supra-regional analysis, to go back to Vilashini's earlier point. What's the relation of Indian Ocean history to global history? This is one of the questions that I've also been thinking about lately. How can Indian Ocean studies refine approaches to global past? And at the same time, what are the limits of the Indian Ocean as a conceptual frame? And I think a final point of consideration is that we've seen in the recent past, particularly since the end of the Cold War, interregional organizations, states, and a number of political movements, and we've seen this in East Africa in particular, political movements embracing the concept of the Indian Ocean as a field. So I think generally academia, the arts, museology, forms of tourism, as well as state policy, have been running on these parallel tracks. But those interests have often been quite different. And I think moving forward, the kind of convergences and divergences of those interests deserve more reflection. But I just want to end by saying that from my perspective, the exponential growth of the field also calls for more forums of engagement and conversation. I think the fluidity of the field is incredibly valuable, and I think that its fractured nature has some benefits, but at the same time we can also benefit, I think, from perhaps more long-term spaces of interaction that create platforms for every sub-region to engage with others. And that hasn't always been true in the past. So anyway, my point is that long-term spaces of interaction, I think, could be incredibly valuable, perhaps building on the many thematic events that we've all been involved with. Of course, McGill has an annual conference. Sheridan College in Perth has, perhaps many of you have been involved in these conferences in the past, a biennial series. And the GU working group seems to be moving in this direction as well, which is really, really exciting. Because I think that permanent platforms for engagement, multiple platforms for engagement, would be incredibly beneficial for both expanding this conversation and expanding it in ways that are multidisciplinary and engage all of the Indian Ocean's subregions. So I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. This was a great survey of the disciplinary and the institutional landscape of Indian Ocean studies. Now we'll continue with Ananya and Ari's initially joint, or first separate and then joint presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Firat. And it was really a pleasure to listen to what co-presenters, co-panelists had to say, because they've anticipated in many ways, I think, what we are leading into with our work. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to say a very brief framing comment. I'll hand over to Ari. We are going to do a back and forth, basically. And at some point, there'll be a PowerPoint. So of course, it's a great pleasure to be here as part of this webinar, because the last time Firat, Jeremy, and I met, the distinction between virtual and in real life meetings hadn't yet become commonplace. And at that time, in real life, I was presenting to an audience which included the two of you, my literary analysis of Ari Gautier's novels. And today, I'm delighted to be here with him. So this is also the paradoxes of this time we are going through, because between the conference in February and the webinar today, a lot has happened. Ari and I have become official collaborators, and on this cultural platform that we've launched on Facebook, Latine Creole. And it is really about this platform as an example of what you've asked us to talk about: new approaches, new methods, new ways of thinking about Indian Ocean humanities. That's why I thought, let's actually show this platform itself, as a way to understand this new kind of method we are trying to develop. So first of all, what we're going to do is Ari will speak about his writing. I have no idea what he's going to say, so it is as much a surprise to me as everyone else, but he's going to say something about his work. And then I will say something about my own journey, which has led me to the point that, we recognize something that made us want to collaborate. And after that, we'll talk about the collaboration. So over to you, Ari.
Okay. See there? This is Madagascar. And here is India. Come closer. You see this small dot? That is Pondicherry. It's all in the same ocean, the Indian Ocean. My father sipped his whiskey and winked at my mother's cousin. Suzette was perplexed. Pensively, she was looking at the map for a long time, forgetting to eat her zebu steak. This is the last time they would sit together in the military mess in Ansirabe. Some weeks later, my mother, Rashwazanani, left for Pondicherry. She will never cross again the Indian Ocean to go back to Madagascar. As a 5-year-old boy, I would stand on the seafront in Pondicherry, holding my Creole nanny's hand. Hello, Maman, baby. Embarrassed, she would say, allez de l'autre côté. To fill my mother's vacuum, my world was inhabited by Kutipiska, the immortal pirate sailing all over the Indian Ocean, redressing the wrongs. The Count of Monte Cristo would become a Raja of the Lakshadweep, where nobody could find his treasure. and Sindbad was my eternal maritime hero. The Indian Ocean became the magic space where my sorrow got drowned. So, I mean, from childhood, I've been obsessed obsessed by the Indian Ocean, because I used to live in Pondicherry, the coastal area, and I was born in Madagascar. So again, it's part of Indian Ocean. So when my father explained to Suzette that this is Madagascar, this is Pondicherry, suddenly that immense, huge mass of water became a small lake. It was so close, but at the same time, so far away from one place to another. And when I started to write, and unconsciously, the sea came to me. Indian Ocean is part of my narration. In all my books, I talk about Indian Ocean. It can be from Karnista to Lakshmi, where she stands from from Varkala and facing the Arabic Ocean, Arabian Sea, sorry, and then comes to Pondicherry. She's in front of the Gulf of Bengal. So this exile is all the time there. It's moving, migrating exile, also longing for the sea. And as it in Tinai, the same thing. Gilbert Tata was born in Guadeloupe, ended up in Pondicherry, and his grandfather, who studied from Pondicherry as indentured labor, ends up in Guadeloupe, and Breton seafarer had a shipwreck in Maldives. So all this narration evolves in my Indian Ocean, and for a long time I've been asking myself why this Indian Ocean is so obsessive to me, and I understood later on because of that very early exile from Madagascar to Pondicherry. And my third book again talks about the same thing, but this is more in a historical way, because I'm taking the issue of the Tamil textiles who have been traveling all around Southeast Asia, up to Mali and up to Africa, and shape a narrative of one family with shifting identities. And now I can reveal you, it can be it will really please you, Ananya, because I told you I call my book Pondicherry, une saga familiale, n'est-ce pas? Now, recently I changed the idea. It's going to be Pondicherry, une saga créole. So, okay. So here, this my fourth book I'm working on. So it's all this archipelago of fragments which connect it to human tragedies. So this is from Vietnam, Pondicherry to Vietnam, to Djibouti, to Guadeloupe, to Réunion Island, to Mauritius, and all over. So here you go.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thanks for giving us that overview of your work, and the surprise, which even, the surprise of the change of the title, which I think is an interesting testament to what the work we've been doing together for the past few months. So I would like to come in here with a little account of how I came to the Indian Ocean. So my interest in the Indian Ocean began about 15 years ago with the supervision of PhD students wanting to work on the literature, Anglophone and Francophone literature of Mauritius. I'm not trained as a comparative literature person, technically, but my background is philology. I did my PhD in Germanic philology, so I'm very used to moving between languages. It doesn't really frighten me or scare me. I like it. So I was quite happy to supervise my students in both Francophone and Anglophone literature, and that's how I got to know about the Creoles of Mauritius as well. But since around this time, I was also teaching Caribbean literature under the rubric of the post-colonial. I started getting interested in thinking about the links between these spaces. And this is, as I said, about 15 years ago already, how diasporic populations in these two worlds relate to each other, not merely the Indian descendant populations of, say, the Western Indian Ocean and the Caribbean, but the Indo and the Afro-descendant populations of all these spaces and how they relate to each other. So these ideas then ultimately became a strand in a project I directed, Modern Moves, which was funded by an ERC advance grant. And that finished a couple of years ago. And Modern Moves basically investigated the history and popularity of African heritage popular dances. But within this frame, me and my team, we also investigated the relationship between performative and embodied cultures of African and Indian heritage diasporic groups in spaces where both lived side by side, thanks to the layered histories of enslavement and indentured labor. And at that point, the link languages, if you like, between all these spaces, the languages we were dealing with, apart from Creoles, of course, were English and French. But soon, studying the Portuguese-speaking world, in particular through this project, Modern Moves, it became apparent that these Afro-Asian interactions also happened through other entangled vectors of expansionism, colonialism, mercantile histories. So it wasn't just about indentured labor and slavery, but there were all these other ways in which people were moving and interacting. And in this way, along with the Francophone and Anglophone worlds, the Lusophone also had to be added to the mix. So my work really is very interested in always going back to language as a vector of connection and communication rather than separation. So basically, two things started happening. Me and my team in Modern Moves started looking more and more at the Indian Ocean and the Black Atlantic as a linked continuum of cultural transformation and encounter, and of creolization, that space of encounter between different, all kinds of differences. Creolization as a lens to study cultural history and memory across this transoceanic continuum. So these two concepts then came together in what I'm now calling transoceanic creolization, and I've spent the last 2 years kind of writing a series of articles devoted to this issue, culminating with a long essay which is going to come out in Modern Asian Studies on the dance form called the Mando of Goa. And this essay in a way took me to a new place, which was the relationship of the Deccan Peninsula hinterland to the transoceanic vectors connecting a place like Goa to the Eastern and Western Indian Ocean, as well as to the North and South Atlantic. Because we can't forget Europe, in the mix. That's also there in the Atlantic world. So around this time, I began seeking a way to integrate all these inter-imperial trajectories that I was also pursuing to develop this idea of transoceanic creolization. And the Dutch started coming more and more into the picture, particularly because I started taking an interest in textiles. So, and the Dutch were the mover of textiles from Java all the way to Africa via their factories in Holland. So I realized that these vectors were converging historically at several points up and down the peninsular coastline of India that left their material traces on the post-colonial present. And basically I began searching for a novelist of Pondicherry who could give me the literary material that I needed to develop that I could comprehend the Indian Ocean with through these various vectors. And I kind of found him. I met Ari and his work, and in a way things clicked together. And my project Creole Indias was kind of already taking shape before I met Ari, but on reading his novels and understanding that he was doing so many similar things to me, but in an imaginative way, that I kind of again realized that I wanted to reorient this massive possibility around Creole Indias through a sort of decentered center of Pondicherry and a method that we call archipelagic. So by April 2020, this project took on a new collaborative form with the novelist himself, and we called it Le Tinay Creole, where Le Tinay is Ari's term. It's like a veranda of a Tamil Franco-Pondicherrian house, which gives the title to his second novel. It's a meeting space for people, and that's where all the characters he's talking about, all these journeys he's talking about, they all actually converge on the Tinay. So we took the Tinay and we added to it creolization, which is my working principle, to present a new way of thinking about India's relationship to the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds in a kind of archipelagic frame. So at this point, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a little video we developed. It's only a few seconds to present our idea of the Tinay Creole to the world. And once we do that, I'm going to hand over to Ari to perhaps say a few things about how this platform actually came into being. So let me do that. Can you see it? I'm going to start it again.
Yeah, you have to start it again.
Yeah, I will. Okay, over to you, Ari.
Yeah, so actually, Ananya set up a meeting for me in Paris in l'École des hautes études sciences sociales in March 2020, where I was supposed to meet a group of academics who were going to talk about my work. So there was around 5 to 6 people. And unfortunately, that time the pandemic started and we couldn't move. And I was really devastated because this is the first time where a group of people, really interesting people who could have gone to my work and analyze and see what they can extract from that literature. And so while we were talking, how do we go about it? Because since we didn't know how long this is going to take, one day, one of my friends, Pascal Goeta, who is my liseuse préférée, as I say, and she said, I would like to read the passage of your book on a Tinai. He said, how do you do that? He said, no, let's create a Tinai virtual Tinai. So that's interesting. And then I said, okay, instead of you reading only my book, which is okay, how long are you going to read my book? It's not that interesting. Why don't I create a Tinai virtual where I invite the world on my Tinai? So mean in the sense, I could invite artists, writers, intellectuals, academics, and all kind of people to come and discuss as a Tinai. As you saw on the video, the Tinai is that small platform where people sit. So that's what we do in Pondicherry or in India. So it's a place where we call en palabre. So we just discuss for the sake of discussing or to understand or things that we don't normally understand. So, and then I brought this idea to Ananya saying, okay, listen, I would like to start a Tinai virtual Tinai. What do you think? She said, wow, this is a marvelous idea. So we decide to see what is the right platform. How do we do this? What are the tools, the digital tools we can use? Since it's a pandemic, nobody can meet. How do we do that? So we came up with it at Tinai Creole. Wilfried created that beautiful logo, which is, again, there's so many references in that logo itself.
The logo. Yeah, we wanted to. Shall I just talk a little bit about that, Ari, at this point? Because in a way, this was a very interesting materialization of the linking of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic worlds that is a part of both our vision. Because Wilfried Gautier, he is a friend and a colleague of mine who dates from my project Modern Moves. He's a DJ based in Paris, a salsa DJ, and he's also a graphic designer. And he did the entire graphic look for my ERC project because I wanted somebody who knew the music and also had this graphic talent to devise my logo. But then he also came on board now to imagine a Tinai Creole because he's from Martinique, and we both Ari and I were immediately attracted by the possibility of getting somebody from the Atlantic world to realize our Indian Ocean architectural, kind of vision, and in a graphic that would convey this succinctly. And it worked. We think it worked very well. But not only that, it was he who told us, why don't you spell Creole with a K rather than a C? Because we were thinking of, should we have Creole with a accent, in the French way, or should we have a Creole in the English spelling? And he was like, why don't you just have a Creole in the Creole way? And we were like, yeah, why not? Because this is actually what we want to do. We want to use our platform to dig up all these demotic histories, which are on the interstices of master narratives. And this little tweak of choosing a K rather than a C in itself became an opening out, a lever to do so many other things. So those are the sorts of conversations that Ari and I had from the 6th of April, when he came to me with this idea that let's do something virtual, to the moment we launched the platform 2 months ago, almost 26th of May. Do you want to say a little bit about the process, Ari, or are you just to add to the kinds of things we discussed or the technology we decided to use?
I mean, the technology is very simple. It's just Facebook Live. We go on Facebook Live, and so we use StreamYard because it has multiple possibilities to have more panelists, and so also the video material that we provide is a better quality. Did some research, and we have a small team with us who can organize stuff. So in that way, our first event was really successful with Kalpana Marimutu and Gladys Francis. So slowly we are creating and interesting events. Maybe you should talk about the curating and what do we do?
Let me do that. I'll share the screen again because we have our flyers of the 3 events we've done so far, and people can have a quick look, and I'll talk through what are the kinds of rationales behind our choosing, or they will be apparent also to everybody perhaps. So let me do that now. Thanks, Ari. So this was our first event, the Vernissage. Perhaps both Kalpana Marimutu and Gladys Francis will be known to everybody, but it was a kind of, you could say, a more classic academic kind of a discussion, but we very carefully chose people who represented both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds, and we are quite committed to, again, a bilingual or multilingual environment. Both Ari and I speak in French and English and translate for each other, and the same was true of our panelists. The next thing we did was this is really where we are coming to the heart of the matter. What are we trying to do actually? How are we trying to connect certain stories? We are not, what Ari mentioned, the archipelago of fragments, is a phrase we came up with to explain our manifesto and our rationale and our vision. It is a bit of what, in a way, it's a spatialization of what Vilashini was saying, this looking out and looking in. The looking out for us is looking out across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean worlds for sure. Now looking in for me and Ari is also looking at the hinterland, the peninsular hinterland, and seeing what kind of connections can we dredge up that are now lost. And the connections between Pondicherry and Goa, for example, are very important for us. Even the music you heard in the beginning in the jingle is from the Mando, the music I've studied, corresponding to the dance form I wrote about. And so we decided to bring together Sonia Shirsat, who's a very famous fadista of Goa, and Prabhu Edward, who's a very well-known percussionist based in Paris, but he's from Pondicherry. And we created this incredible conversation between these two people. For example, Sonia said, I had no idea that I would have so much in common with somebody from Pondicherry, but historically the Portuguese were both in Pondicherry and of course in Goa. So, you know, there are all these resonances that we are excavating through these encounters we are staging. The next event we did, which was literally just this weekend, on Friday, we noticed in our Facebook posts that food is an extremely important, again, activator of memory for all kinds of people. People really love to talk about food and how memories of their communities are intermeshed with food. And so we were interested in the food in that sense of traveling creolized communities. And this is what we did. We actually linked the movement of Gujaratis through East Africa to Britain, a story that many know, but maybe wouldn't connect again thematically or otherwise with stories of French Indians moving to Indochina, during the French colonial period. And these stories we brought together in our event through food, which again seems an unlikely connector, but it worked very well. This particular video is almost received 2,000 views, and it was only published on Friday. So and you can see here this is our logo, the one which our friend, the Martinican DJ, produced for us. And we think it realizes very well, again, the architectural, the modern, and, a certain sort of, we don't want to be in these nostalgic visual approximations of what we are about. We want to radiate some kind of cosmopolitanism and modernity through the graphic, which I believe we have done. So I would like to, I know we're running out of time, so I think what we would like to do is just maybe give a few sentences on what we've experienced in running this incredibly popular and surprisingly popular cultural platform that we launched almost out of frustration because we couldn't meet and plan a more conventional approach to our shared interests, academic and writerly. Ari, would you like to say something here, or do you want to say a few words about? Are you good? Okay. Well, I think just very quickly, I think what Vilashini said about vernacularization, the term that Niall Green introduced in that important essay of his, as a counter to the Anglophone preoccupations of most people, working on the Indian Ocean. Well, first of all, I think we already are doing something different by drawing attention to the Francophone, sort of worlds of the same space, the Indian Ocean. But I think we're going a step further by throwing into people's, imaginations the idea of the Creole possibility, which has, because of its very nature, is multiplicitous and fractal. So you can be Creole in many different ways, and this is what we like about it. And that's why we offer as another possibility, another alternative to vernacularization, which also for me is too stuck in a certain way to something, the freeing and resistive mode of being Creole. And so our use of this word has caught the imagination of a lot of people who are very happy to rediscover their Creoleness as a result. The looking in and looking out, the connecting of dots, joining of dots on the peninsular hinterland of the Indian kind of subcontinent to these outward-facing transoceanic histories is something that is extremely important, I think, at this stage where territorial and continental narratives of Indianness are ever more prevalent. And we want to puncture those, we want to actually archipelagize the continent through this connective mode. And that's why it's equally important for us to think of how can we connect Goa, Pondicherry, and say the Hooghly contours in Bengal, as much as it is also important for us to connect these dots across the oceans to, say, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Réunion, Mauritius, and so on, Madagascar. So we want to do a multi-directional connection, which doesn't forget the possibility of making islands within the continents. Okay, so that's very important for us. The second thing, as a working method, which we've extracted also, we see the popularity of our posts and we also see, okay, that's working. People really like it. People are very engaged with any forms of memory that we excavate or reactivate through our posts. And these memories are to do with straddling that divide between the material and the embodied. And I know, Vilashini, you also gestured toward that. So the idea of material histories coming on the bodies of people who live with those materialities is something that is become increasingly apparent to us and that's why people like food. That's why people are so happy about the possibility of talking about food, because that's exactly where the material and the embodied resides. So we are really using Tinai Creole as a kind of lab of ideas and emotions, I think. We use memory and multilingualism as levers to excavate these hidden histories that have been buried under the weight of monocolonial narratives, and also a kind of linear thrust of decolonization, which took on the nation and didn't, and forgot about other possibilities. We really want to decontinentalize and archipelagize these narratives. And I think this will automatically make a range of subaltern players enter the fray, but also other players like the merchants and other kinds of cultural brokers who are often not seen as subaltern enough, so they don't enter the fray that way. So, in this way, I think Ari and I are really happy that we found a way to bring together our very different approaches to similar issues. We also both have similar feelings towards our own histories, our own pasts, and therefore, I think the pandemic has given us this incredibly, amazingly porous way to explore all these issues. And I actually feel, and we both agree on this, that had we met in Paris and done the usual academic thing, we wouldn't have had the Tinai Creole, and we wouldn't have been able to spread the word so rapidly to so many people in a way that, as an academic, I'm going to take back and do things with it in the normal academic way. Ari is already reshaping his novel's title. So, we are doing our own things with this space we created, but it's also space for other people, for everybody to enter and to rethink their own place within the Indian Ocean, and indeed transoceanic, sort of scalar spaces that we are unfolding for people. So I think I'll stop there. And I don't know if Ari wants to add a last word, or we're good. Okay.
Thank you, Ananya and Ari. I think, in a way, your collaboration is definitely a signal in terms of thinking about the future directions in the Indian Ocean Humanities. This collaboration between creative artists and academics, thanks to the affordances of the virtual. But I have to stop here with I can't make any further comments. We have a really brilliant group of participants from the different parts of the world. So I would like to open the floor for question and answer. We already have one proactive attendee, Debojyoti Das. She wrote, I am keen to ask the first speaker on the question of planetary violence, Anthropocene. How do we use memory in a liquid field when you talk about tactility? There are other questions coming, but I think in a way we can, participants can also raise hands, and we can have the question and answer session in a more vibrant live format as well.
Do you want me to answer, or?
Sure.
Maybe just to both particularly, and maybe to open it up. Thank you, Debojyoti, for that question. And I think it's touching on something that has become a really important emerging aspect of Indian Ocean work, which is the focus on the non-human. Right? It's always been attuned, as I said earlier, to this kind of thick materiality of the object world through which we have seen human cultures and relationships and networks happening. And I think that this densely imaginative and historical body of work has always been able to flesh the things of the past so that we see their lives. There's, their kind of luxury appeals, the dense sedimented histories of what attaches to them as they move through time and space. There's now a shift, and I think this has a lot to do with Anthropocene eco-critical approaches, to see that same kind of density and accumulated sedimented history in the things of the natural world. And that has to do not just with the kind of taking water or fluidity or liquidity as an approach, how to have a relational method, how to have a method, as Ananya said, that is not fixed or sort of in the way you were seeing vernacularization, but something that has a more processual nature, that ebbs and flows, that comes and goes, that has high points and low points, all of that. So I think that is part of what we have often seen in studies of the natural world. But when I'm also thinking about, and this goes to the question, how the scale of memory can be opened up when we ask this question, not just at the level of human actors or human cultural formations, a national memory, a regional memory, an ethnic memory, etc. Those are all a huge part of it. But what happens when we also start to think about the memory that can inhere in natural spaces? So think about, geological sedimentation, which makes rocks and strata a record of the past. Or think about tidal ebbs and flows, right, in riverine spaces and the mangroves of the Sundarbans or various other places, so dear to Ghosh. But they create ideas of natural memory that can be layered on top of human-made accounts of memory, and we can sort of expand memory's contours and its work by, I would say, you talk about decontinentalizing, Ananya, and I also think there's a certain amount of desubjectifying of memory, because we need to get memory out of a proprietary economy, right? This culture's, that culture's, this moment, that moment. Obviously it works that way, and that is part of the work of doing a memory studies focused regional project. But I also think that somehow constrains what memory can then become more or less a proxy for identity. And I want to open this. I think that one of the things, this goes to Ananya's interest in creolization, one of the things the Indian Ocean word reveals to us is that identity is not fixed, that it is always in a state of becoming, right? And memory politics can also show this work. And I'm thinking, maybe just to end this, there is a line at the opening of The Hungry Tide. Those first few paragraphs merges the description of the riverine ebbs and flows of the mangrove, and how it's never the same thing. It's a different thing on one day as the waters wash in. It's a different thing the next day. It is the same thing, but it's constantly changing. And then the passage folds back, and it compares this entire part of the coastal sea line to in the fringe, the ragged fringe at the end of India's sari. And I love this moment because it is text, it is textile, it is natural history, it is a sense of the history embedded in things, and also the ever-changing quality that happens when you look at something with a defamiliarizing metaphor, like the Sundarbans, the ragged fringe of India's sari. And so it seems to me, I think, to go back to your question, I think that the Indian Ocean is so extraordinarily rich in a metaphorical as well as historical language of description, and that to me has been very interesting. I think it's one of the things that produces the kind of innovation in the mapping of space, time, and identity, and indeed the natural world. So I would want us to really take our metaphorics as well as our materialities as resources.
Thank you. Our great student assistant Taha says, Professor, let's try to limit the answers so that we can answer more questions within the time frame. Don't shoot the messenger. One question to Jeremy. This is from Fahad. He gives his thanks, and I would love to get Jeremy to expand on his thoughts on the intellectual purchase of the Indian Ocean in the discipline of history. I agree with everything that you said, but I don't know that it distinguishes the field all that much from, say, Atlantic or Mediterranean history. What makes the Indian Ocean a fruitful place to think with or for historians? I think that's a question probably applies to other humanists as well.
Sorry, I have to unmute. You'd think I would have learned by now. But yeah, this is Fahad's question is fantastic, and perhaps he can better answer it than I can. But I'll give it a shot. I was just reading, the end of the question. Now, I'd also love to hear more about the connections between Indian Ocean history and the growing field of global history. And I think that's kind of an open question. The propensity of fields like Atlantic, Mediterranean, Pacific for that matter, is to again, focus inward in the definition of that, you know, of those connectivities or those circularities, to use it, you know, the language of the conference in Doha. And I think that there, maybe speaking to Ananya's and Ari's project, you know, one of the problems with that is that that sort of this centrifugal force of that research sometimes can exclude connectivities that go way beyond that particular region. And so that's why I've been really interested in thinking about how concepts of the Indian Ocean have changed over time, both within and from without. And I think all of these are really open questions, but certainly in terms of the latter part of that, of Fuad's question, that question about global history, I think we have, we're in a position now to sort of be able to link the Indian Ocean historiography with broader, you know, currents of global history to really insert the Indian Ocean into those broader analyses. And this is why I think this research on Japan's engagements with Hideaki Suzuki gave a talk at the conference in Doha in February, and I think the depth and complexity of those relationships were really indicative of the way in which the Indian Ocean circumstances radiated to the rest of the world. So I think that's one way of engaging global history. Looking at the way in which the Indian Ocean's deeply impacted other world regions. Indian Ocean relations themselves had far-reaching consequences than simply within the boundaries or the rim of the ocean itself. Now, the first question is maybe even more complicated. The intellectual purchase of the Indian Ocean in the discipline of history. And what distinguishes it from, say, the Atlantic or Mediterranean history? Well, one of the things that, of course, you know, many people have argued, historians in particular have argued, is the depth of the relationships as opposed to the Atlantic field. And I think there's a lot of value in that, in understanding that we're talking about relationships that don't begin at a certain point in time. There's no historical beginning to the Indian Ocean as a field of relation. But at the same time, I think that the ways in which the forces of the early modern world and the modern world have affected Indian Ocean societies, and Indian Ocean societies have affected those forces. Demonstrate a lot of parallels with Mediterranean and Atlantic. I think that in terms of the historical discipline itself, it's just in a lot of ways easier, the way that many of us were trained in terms of area studies. It's easier to engage with a kind of interregional dialogue than talking about, say, the relationship of the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. But I think in many ways we are talking about so many of the same things, which is speaks directly to Fuad's point, is that the distinctions methodologically or theoretically between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, for say, aren't particularly strong necessarily. But I also think that, this is the last point I'll make before I get too far off track, is that I think it's important to recognize that the importation of certain concepts from the Atlantic field, which is incredibly rich, theoretically, methodologically rich, don't always fit or fall apart or need to be applied or thought through in very different ways for the Indian Ocean. I think that's the distinction that I would make with the Mediterranean as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. By the way, if you would like to raise hand and ask your question, that's for the audience, that's perfectly welcome. There were two questions from Noit and Lalita on the concept of the Creole, more directly toward Ananya and Ari's project. Let me have Lalita says, Tinai as a platform for cultural exchange can forge diverse views. How do you intend to accommodate this diversity without foregoing identity of the Tinai? And on a parallel note, the other question is around the term Creole. Might this not be a misnomer when applied regionally? The term has a particular resonance in, say, the Caribbean. Applying it elsewhere then removes and misplaces it, acting as cultural co-optation. Ananya and Ari, if you would like to engage with this question.
Thank you. Ari, do you want to take the question about the Tinai? It is something for you, I think, no? What do you feel?
Yeah. What was the question again?
The question was, let me read it out again to you. It was from Lalita Joseph. Tinai as a platform for cultural exchange can forge diverse views. How do you intend to accommodate this diversity without foregoing the identity of the Tinai?
That's very interesting. I think it's also a challenge. I mean, for us, I mean, for you and me, how we make the Tinai Creole as diverse as possible without diluting the essence of the Tinai itself.
Yeah.
Yes. I think we're just at the beginning of this beautiful aventure, comme on dit. And of course, we might make some mistakes in the course of doing things, but I think I'm very confident that every time we curate something, we are very, very careful of not forgetting these transoceanic circularities to make the connection between oceans and, as our manifesto says, the archipelago of fragments. So yes, we make sure that we don't do any mistakes, and at a certain point, we might make some mistakes. I mean, it's so human, right? We are just, end of the day, we are just humans. We might make some mistakes, but we'll have the tools and the means to correct ourselves in order to have it as diverse as possible, and to be inclusive. That's very important also, and to also to cover as many areas it's required to understand the la creolisation.
Yeah, so, actually, Ari, it's important that you mention the archipelago of fragments. But this is really a phrase that popped into our heads. I don't even know how. But once we got it, we were like, this is it. Because it really is a structure that allows for those so-called mistakes. By the way, the best inventions in human history also happen through mistakes, like cheese, and discovery of an oyster. So I think mistakes are fine. It's like, but what do you have a structure which can reincorporate the mistake and readjust the framework. So the archipelago of fragments is a fractal framework, which is, as we know, it's a framework that's archipelagic. Anyway, it reproduces itself. So we adjust. So, for example, in very kind of like black and white terms, if it comes to curation, it means that at the moment, for the first set of events that we have done and we continue to do for the next few months, we are definitely going to try to always have a dialogue with someone or something from Pondicherry. So this kind of orients us in a way, but so a lot of Ari's fans were obviously interested in his work because he represents Pondicherrian voices, which are very rare actually from a contemporary moment. So they were perhaps confused in the beginning that, is this a Pondicherry? What's happened to the Tinai? It's become a Tinai Creole, so accept it, and people are just enjoying it. They're, so everybody is connecting with things that they never imagined they would connect with before. So in structuring principles, the Pondicherry element gives us a kind of, as I said, a decentered frame. I think that's also your phrase, Ari, and then I thought I liked it so much, I'm stealing it. So, that's the way we are doing this. In terms of diversity and inclusion, because, yes, if you're curating something for an hour and a half and you want to have a lot of things in there, often we want people who have interesting stories and we want to fit it all in. So we program tightly for that hour, almost like a control freakishly, in my opinion. That's me, by the way. But I have other people to offset that. So we have this tightly curated hour and a half, but then we also go completely improvised on live sessions where we are free flowing and we invite other people on very spontaneously from the chat function. And so that whole matter balances the necessity to get people who are a little more formed in the ideas to be packed into an hour to deliver the goods. Whereas the live and improvised session allows a more open framework where people can really express themselves, and we also don't know what we're going to talk about. So this is the way we manipulate the medium to get the best of all kinds of possibilities for diversity. Going now to the idea of Creole. Now this question, I think really it's a very important one, and I'm going to use the opportunity to really clarify a few things very quickly. Firstly, the question says, might this not be a misnomer, Creole, or Creole with a K, when applied transregionally? The term has a particular resonance in the Caribbean. I'm afraid this person, you are not fully conversant with the whole history of the word Creole, so I'm going to use this opportunity to tell everybody about it. But firstly, it's the linguists who started writing about Creole languages. And these were first the contact languages of the Pacific. People were taught. So there is no belonging. Creole doesn't belong to the Caribbean as a term for a heuristic term to understand things. As a way to describe people and cultures, historically it appeared like a Parthenon, like independently, the genesis of the term popped up here and there, like, I don't know, like human beings made pots in different parts of the world more or less at the same time. So you had people historically calling themselves Creole for any number of reasons, and Cape Verde in the Caribbean, right in various parts of South America, and in the Indian Ocean. Ari himself talked about his Creole nanny, so he was using Creole in a particular way. And it was not, as this person has said, a misnomer, because he used it in the way he used it. It's applicable to his space and his history. So the word Creole is very useful because it can move around like this, and there is nothing to say that it's a misnomer from anywhere, because historically it evolved to express a certain condition. And that is why when we say Creole, we are definitely not using it to suggest mixing in general. It always has a very strong connection to those histories of violence and not so violent encounters. But all of them were encounters, unexpected encounters, and they had a historical moment in which they happened. And when we say the word Creole, we mean you to remember that history, and we don't want you to forget it. So I hope I've answered all the different points in that question there. And definitely it has a particular resonance to the Caribbean, but applying it elsewhere certainly does not remove or misplace it, or God help, suggest cultural co-optation, because the word Creole militates against that kind of co-optation. It in itself is. So I hope that this has clarified our manifesto as well as to why we want to use the word Creole.
Thank you. I also noticed that Vilashini was answering some of the questions, especially I think clearly there is an interest in feminist and sexuality studies in the Indian Ocean. So you engaged with these questions. I wonder if among the participants anyone likes to engage in the discussion, now raising hands and join the discussion orally. And we have, now I need to find the raised hand. Sorry.
Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So thank you, Papa panelists, for this wonderful talk. So I'm a student of history. I'm pursuing history in India. So my question was that, so when we talk about the Indian Ocean, So how do we deal with this aspect of this frontier, that the Indian Ocean was seen as a frontier and not as a center of any empire or any kingdom? And also, how do we speak of the histories of groups like the pirates who used to operate in the Indian Ocean, like the Portuguese pirates, and also in fact the Ottoman and the Portuguese empires had a fight over who could be the hegemon of the trade in Indian Ocean.
Who would?
I think. Shall we give this to the historian in the room?
Sure, I'd be happy to speak to. Well, maybe I'll just speak to the first question because I don't have as good of an answer for the second question. But of course, this. Well, let me just say, related to the second question. Of course, that also relates to the this question of frontiers, the question of boundaries, the question of the Indian Ocean as a field of relation that clearly is affected and affecting of the wider world, be it the Mediterranean in the case of the Ottoman interests in the 16th century in particular, or Portuguese, beginning at the end of the 15th century. So I think there actually is some correlation between those questions. But I should say that this question of boundaries or the limits of the Indian Ocean, I have thought about a bit, and one of the conclusions that I've come to is that I think we always have to be extremely mindful of not a kind of contemporary geography, but the ways in which different societies, different places, different locales, different individuals within what we now think of as the Indian Ocean rim engaged with each other differently over time, and how individuals, societies have been drawn into or less affected by those relationships. So I think if you want to think of it as a map, it's an incredibly dynamic map that has, multiple dimensions. One is that of the materiality, the connections that many of us look at. But the other, the material connections that many of us look at, but the other dimension is the imaginary aspect to the region. And that's something I was actually speaking about at the conference in Doha in February, that the way in which the region has been imagined as a region has actually shifted pretty dramatically, even in the relatively recent past. I use the kind of case study of Swahili, the Swahili uses of geographical terminologies and how this changed pretty significantly from the 19th century to the mid-20th century. And I think that it just kind of refines that point, that when we're talking about the Indian Ocean, Cape Town, for instance, the Western Cape is very dramatically drawn into Indian Ocean relations from the 17th century on. So we see this kind of expansion, retraction in the 19th century, obviously parts of East Africa that had been more distantly connected become more firmly connected to both global capitalism and the particularities of the wider Indian Ocean region. So I think that we're talking about incredibly dynamic maps of both physical relationships, physicality and materiality, as well as the imagination. And those two, this is the last point I'll make, that those two don't always articulate with each other. And so one of the things that I find most interesting is the way in which the Indian Ocean has been reimagined in the post-colonial, but particularly the post-Cold War era, that the Indian Ocean has become relevant, as I mentioned very briefly, by states that have provided funding for certain initiatives. There's been this kind of buy-in on the part of policymakers that's it's not necessarily about contemporary connections, but about making future connections, or about creating a different kind of economic zone. And that's just one aspect. Of course, we can talk about many, many other aspects as well. So I think the imagination of the region and of linkages and the import of those linkages can be something that can be looked at alongside materiality, but isn't necessarily coterminous with it. That's probably the shortest answer that I can give.
I wanted to take up the pirate question. Thank you, Jeremy, for that answer. Just very briefly, and it's not something I have a lot of expertise on, but I have a student who was interested in it, and I think that one of the sites that emerges from the phenomenon of the pirate, which of course has a rich imaginative and historiographical history around it, is this concept of how, looking through piracy, we can think differently about things like sovereignty, things like territoriality, things like the centrality or possibly not centrality of a history of capital in the Indian Ocean world. So what are pirate economics? What are pirate civic spaces? And I think about in the Atlantic world, some of the wonderful work that's been done on the sort of the little social compact of the ship. Right? How does it work? How does it function? How does it become a sort of a supplement to land-based and territorial-based concepts of sovereignty and of the structures of power? And that history is one that that gets taken up, I think, in a number of imaginative novelistic writings about it. You also see it in the way the discourse around Somali piracy was so popular in the West. Why that? What is the enduring presence in a neo-colonial global imaginary of the figure of the pirate, and how could we also tell alternative, sort of deeper stories of the alternatives of piracy? There are equally histories of gender and sexuality that are embedded with the notions of piracy, both in the Atlantic world and I think also in the Indian Ocean world. And so it seems to me there's something about the experimental space, the space outside certain versions of contractual or established nation-state law that are really important to think through Indian Ocean paradigms, because that gets at the ways in which the field is not necessarily deriving from the same genealogical sequence of historical categories, right? I mean, you don't invent it all with social contract law or early nationalism or particular notions of property. There are counterparts to that. And that seems to me to be a really important thing of what piracy as both object and method stands to offer.
Yeah, if I can add to that, because I actually taught a course called Post-Colonial Pirates this last semester, and it was hugely popular. And I'm going to continue, I'll teach it again semester one that's coming up on us, though of course it will be taught online probably, but anyway. It was a very interesting course because we explored precisely the same things that you have just outlined as questions. One thing I did is, in constructing this course, was to, so we read some classic Atlantic world pirate narratives, but we also read Indian Ocean ones. So we read, for example, Leclesio's Prospector, Cherchador, which is a very important, I think, twist to this meta-narrative of piracies that's been inherited from the Atlantic world. And we also did a lot of work with Somalian pirates through Nuruddin Farah's Crossbones, through Captain Phillips. So it was everything. I mean, it was all there. And we certainly, I can say, tick, tick, tick to all the things you hypothesized. That's pretty much what the students and I worked out on, because it was the first time I was teaching the course. It was also also a kind of tabula rasa for me as to where we would go there. It was very interesting to note how the Indian Ocean novelists, be it Farah or Leclerc, were going back to the same tropes of piracy that were kind of coming out of the Atlantic Ocean, were almost kind of pressing against that meta-narrative and saying, we have something else to say. Our pirates are different. The Indian Ocean world is different. And that's why I also very much enjoy Ari starting his narrative to us today with this memory of the pirates that were populating his imagination to fill the lacuna left by his mother's death. So it was very, this again, I mean, there is something absolutely, Anurag, I think, hit a nerve. You're right to say, what about pirates? And we could also add Laskars there, who are very important, the different kind of freelance sea rover. But these sea rovers of the Indian Ocean world, I think, can tell us something specific in the way they've not, I mean, of course, the historians will tell us something about how they operated. But I think very important to see how our literary narratives, imaginative narratives, responding to the memory and inheritance of those pirate stories, like Ari just did for us today, like here, like mentioning the pirates that were important to him, but also we then get the novels, which are doing the same, but they have become novels already. Maybe Ari will give us a pirate novel at some point, who knows. But yeah, so I think these pirates are very important for a number of reasons. And certainly they in like pirates in general tell a story of interrupting capital, but they're interrupting also the Atlantic Ocean hegemony, you know, of taking over all the stories and saying, this is the only way the story of capital can be told, or the story of interrupting capital can be told. Yeah, so I think that's why pirates are great. And they're really, and the reason I only ventured to do a module about pirates is because my nephews went to Seychelles and heard the story of Labous, the pirate there. And my nephew was like 6 or 7, and he was telling me about this pirate story. I'm like, these pirates of the Indian Ocean are very interesting. I must do a module on it. So my nephew is, of course, very pleased because thanks to him, there's a King's College London module, and he's quite thrilled to bits about that. But, you know, there's children's stories. The infantilization of pirates is also very important as to why they entered so heavily children's stories. And again, how the Indian Ocean pirate narratives resist that, you know, particularly that's where the Somalian pirates become very important. They're like, we are here and now. We are not Captain Hook and, you know, Long John Silver. We are pirates in today's world, and we are telling you something about that. So I think pirates are good to think with.
On this great celebration of Indian Ocean pirates, I would like to thank the panelists really sincerely for making their time to join the panel. And this is just the first conversation. We hope that the webinar series will continue with other dimensions, most of which you have invoked in this first panel. So we'll keep the conversation going. And thank you and the participants who made the effort to join us from different parts of the world. Doha time, it is almost 10 p.m. So I think we'll stop here. Thank you, Vilashini, Jeremy, Ananya. Please go ahead, Ari.
No, because I'm the only one, it's not because I'm not polite, but I didn't say thank you for inviting me and say hi to my co-panelists, because I want to give my dramaturg side of my reading. So I didn't say thank you, I didn't say hi. So I started by saying see there. So I'm just wanted to say hi to everyone and thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks so